The morning of May 7th, 1942. Deep inside the Imperial Japanese Navy's technical research facility in Yokosuka, Commander Yukichi Yamamoto stared at the metal carcass laid across 3 workbenches. The device, retrieved from the wreckage at Corregidor just weeks earlier, looked almost laughably primitive. Vacuum tubes the size of sake bottles, wiring that seemed more suited to powering street lamps than winning wars, a massive antenna array that would have embarrassed even the most backward provincial radio station. This was the SCR-268, America's anti-aircraft radar, captured intact when the Philippines fell. The engineers had been working on it for 3 weeks now, documenting every component, every circuit, every frequency. Commander Yamamoto had written in his preliminary report to Naval General Staff that the device appeared to be based on technology the Japanese Navy had already surpassed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. His assistant, Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura, had joked that it looked like something a university student might build for a science fair. But standing before it now, in the cool fluorescent light of the laboratory, Commander Yamamoto felt the first stirrings of something that might have been doubt, because embedded in this crude device was a single, uncomfortable truth. The Americans had fielded this technology in massive numbers, at every base, on every island, protecting every strategic point from the Panama Canal to Pearl Harbor. The Japanese Navy, for all its superiority in night optics, had exactly 0 operational radar sets on its warships when the war began. It is the spring of 1942, 6 months into what Tokyo newspapers call the era of 8 corners under one roof. The conquest of Southeast Asia has exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Singapore, the impregnable British fortress, had fallen in just 70 days. The Dutch East Indies, with their vital oil fields, now flew the rising Sunday. The Philippines, America's crown jewel, in the Pacific, had surrendered after a desperate last stand on Corregidor. Japanese forces controlled an empire spanning from Burma to the Gilbert Islands, from the Aleutians to the approaches of Australia. More territory had been conquered in 6 months than in all of Japan's previous wars combined. The carrier strike force that had devastated Pearl Harbor remained undefeated, having rampaged from Hawaii to Ceylon without losing a single major ship. In the officers' clubs of Yokosuka, Kure, and Sasebo, young staff officers spoke confidently of the war ending by year's end. America, shocked by the speed and ferocity of Japanese expansion, would surely negotiate. The German conquest of Russia seemed imminent. Britain teetered on the edge. Victory appeared inevitable. But in the classified technical intelligence division at Yokosuka, where captured enemy equipment was analyzed, a different picture was emerging, one that few outside the division were permitted to see, one that contradicted everything the Japanese Navy believed about American technological capability. The first hint had come in August 1941, before the war had even begun. A German Navy liaison officer, Kapitän José Karl Wenneker, had warned his Japanese counterparts during a briefing in Tokyo. He had been stationed in Washington as a naval attaché and had observed American industry firsthand. His assessment had been stark. The Americans possessed industrial capacity that defied Japanese comprehension. They had technological depth that spanned universities, corporations, and government laboratories working in coordination. Most troublingly, they had already deployed radar systems across their military in quantities that suggested mass production capabilities Japan could not match. The report had been filed away. German assessments, after all, carried the stain of European prejudice. The Germans had always underestimated Asian powers. Besides, Japanese naval intelligence had its own assessments. American manufacturing was indeed impressive in terms of volume, but Japanese craftsmanship was superior. American technology was practical but crude. Japanese equipment, from the Long Lance torpedo to the Mitsubishi Zero, represented the cutting edge of naval warfare. But now, in May 1942, Commander Yamamoto had 3 captured American radar sets to examine. The SCR-268 from Corregidor, a badly damaged SCR-270 early warning radar, also from Corregidor, and components from British gun-laying radars captured in Singapore. Each told the same story. The Allies had invested enormous resources in developing, producing, and deploying radar technology years before the war began. The SCR-268, despite its crude appearance, was elegantly designed for its purpose. Operating at 200 MHz, it could detect aircraft and provide precise firing solutions for anti-aircraft guns in complete darkness or through cloud cover. Its maximum effective range was approximately 25 miles for aircraft. But range was not what troubled Commander Yamamoto. What troubled him was the date stamped inside the primary oscilloscope unit, 1939. The Americans had been producing this radar in quantity for 3 years before Pearl Harbor. The technical specifications he was compiling suggested that hundreds, perhaps thousands, had been manufactured. The device he was examining had been one of 3 at Corregidor alone. Intelligence reports indicated similar installations at Bataan, at Iba Field, at every major installation in the Philippines. The implications were staggering. While the Imperial Japanese Navy had been perfecting night optics and training lookouts to near superhuman levels of visual acuity, the Americans had been mass-producing electronic eyes that could see over the horizon. The SCR-270 was even more troubling. This early warning radar, though heavily damaged, revealed capabilities that exceeded anything in Japanese development. Its estimated maximum range exceeded 130 miles. At Oahu, on the morning of December 7th, it had detected the first wave of the Pearl Harbor strike force at precisely 100 to 32 miles, providing more than 50 minutes of advance warning. That warning had been dismissed as a flight of American B-17 bombers, but the fact remained. The radar had worked exactly as designed. It had seen Japanese aircraft when they were still beyond the horizon. It had provided range, bearing, and approximate numbers. The system had not failed. The humans interpreting it had failed. Commander Yamamoto drafted his report with meticulous care. The technical specifications were dry and factual: operating frequencies, power outputs, estimated production numbers, maximum detection ranges. But buried in the annexes was an assessment that should have triggered immediate alarm at Naval General Staff. The American radar programs, he wrote, suggested a level of industrial coordination and technical sophistication that Japan had fundamentally misunderstood. These were not laboratory prototypes hastily fielded. They were mature weapons systems, deployed in quantity, integrated into defensive networks that spanned the Pacific. The Americans had begun serious radar development in the mid-1930s. They had established radar schools, trained thousands of operators, created maintenance and logistics networks to support the equipment. Most critically, they had done all of this before the war. While Japanese naval planning had focused on the decisive battle and the spiritual superiority of Japanese sailors, the Americans had been quietly building an electronic infrastructure that could multiply the effectiveness of every gun, every fighter, every ship. The report reached Naval General Staff in early June, just as planning was being finalized for the Midway operation. It was read, noted, and filed. There were more pressing concerns than captured radar equipment. The decisive battle to lure out and destroy the remaining American carriers was just days away. After that victory, technical concerns about radar would be academic. The Americans would have no navy left to protect with electronics. But Commander Yamamoto could not shake a growing sense of unease. In his laboratory, surrounded by the disassembled components of American radar sets, he saw something that admirals in their planning rooms did not. The Americans had not just built better equipment, they had built an entire philosophy of technological warfare that was fundamentally different from Japan's approach. Japanese military technology emphasized perfection in individual weapons. The Type 93 long-lance torpedo was the finest naval torpedo in the world. The Mitsubishi Zero was unmatched in maneuverability and range. Japanese optical rangefinders were superior to anything the Americans possessed. Each weapon represented the pinnacle of its type, maintained and operated by highly trained specialists. But American technology, as revealed in their radar sets, emphasized a different principle: quantity through standardization, ease of maintenance, operator training at scale. The SCR-268 was not the world's most sophisticated radar, but it was reliable, relatively simple to maintain, and could be operated by technicians with months rather than years of training. Most importantly, it could be produced by the hundreds. This was the advantage of American industrial capitalism that Japanese militarists had dismissed as weakness. The Americans could afford to field equipment that was merely good enough because they could field it in overwhelming numbers. They could train operators quickly because the systems were designed for rapid training. They could maintain complex networks of electronic equipment because they had built the industrial base to support them. In late May, as the combined fleet sortied for Midway, Commander Yamamoto was ordered to accelerate work on Japanese radar copies. The Tachi 1 and Tachi 2, based on the captured SCR-268, were to be rushed into production. The Naval General Staff wanted radar systems deployed on major combatants as quickly as possible, not because they understood the strategic implications, but because captured equipment suggested the Americans had radar, and therefore Japan must have it too. But copying a radar was the least of Japan's problems, as events at Midway would soon demonstrate. The issue was not the technology itself. The issue was the entire infrastructure behind it, the training, the tactics, the command structures to exploit radar data, the industrial capacity to produce thousands of sets instead of dozens, the ability to integrate electronic detection with fighter direction, with anti-aircraft fire control, with naval gunnery. The Americans had built all of this before the war. The British had built it during their desperate defense against the Luftwaffe. The Japanese, supremely confident in their night fighting capabilities and the spiritual superiority of their sailors, had built none of it. On June 4, 1942, as 4 Japanese carriers burned in the waters off Midway, the limitations of fighting without radar became apparent. Japanese combat air patrol was positioned entirely by visual detection. When American torpedo bombers attacked, every Zero fighter was drawn down to sea level to intercept them. When American dive bombers arrived minutes later at 14,000 feet, there was no one to stop them. No radar had detected their approach. No fighter director had preserved a high-altitude patrol. The Japanese carriers were as blind as ships had been for thousands of years before electronics changed naval warfare. The Americans, by contrast, had radar on all 3 carriers. The CXAM sets on Enterprise and Yorktown had detected Japanese aircraft at ranges exceeding 70 miles. Fighter directors aboard the carriers had vectored Wildcat fighters to intercept. The system was imperfect, plagued by communications, problems and lack of identification, friend or foe capability. But it worked. It provided 20 to 30 minutes of warning that allowed fighters to climb to intercept altitude. It gave defending ships time to prepare their anti-aircraft batteries. Midway was not lost for lack of radar alone, but radar's absence was one more invisible wound in the body of the combined fleet. The kind of wound that does not kill immediately but bleeds away strength with each passing month. After Midway, the tempo of combat accelerated. The Americans landed on Guadalcanal in August. The battle for that malarial island would be decided as much by radar as by courage or tactics. It became the place where Japanese naval commanders would finally, brutally, learn what fighting without radar truly meant. The night battles around Guadalcanal in the autumn and winter of 1942 and 43 would become a laboratory of technological awakening. A place where Japanese confidence in superior night fighting would collide with American electronics, where centuries of naval tradition would meet 20th century science, where the invisible became the decisive. The first engagement came on August 9th, the Battle of Savo Island. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's cruiser force achieved one of the most complete tactical victories in naval history, sinking 4 Allied cruisers in less than an hour. His ships, relying on superior night optics and brilliantly executed torpedo attacks, had caught the American picket force completely by surprise. The Americans had radar. It had detected Japanese ships, but the information had not been properly interpreted or acted upon. For a brief moment, it seemed that Japanese night-fighting superiority remained intact. Radar, it appeared, was no match for trained eyes, aggressive tactics, and the devastating long-lance torpedo. Naval General Staff incorporated the battle into training materials as evidence of Japanese tactical superiority. The spiritual strength of Japanese sailors had overcome American technology, but careful analysis of the battle revealed uncomfortable truths. The American ships had detected Mikawa's force on radar before visual contact. The cruiser USS Chicago's SG radar had painted Japanese ships at over 20,000 yards, but the Americans had not known what to do with the information. Commanders were not trained in radar-directed night tactics. Communications were inadequate. The technology existed, but the doctrine to exploit it did not. This was a fixable problem. Radar could not be trained like a sailor or imbued with fighting spirit, but tactics could be developed. Officers could be trained. Command structures could be adapted to exploit electronic detection. The Japanese, by contrast, had a problem that was not fixable in the short term. They had virtually no radar at all. Their cruisers and destroyers relied entirely on lookouts whose effectiveness, no matter how well trained, was fundamentally limited by the curvature of the Earth and the darkness of tropical nights. At Naval Technical Research Institute in Yokosuka, Commander Yamamoto and his team worked frantically through the summer and fall of 1942. The Tachi 1 and Tachi 2 radars entered limited production in August. By October, the first sets were being installed on selected battleships and cruisers, but production was glacially slow. Components were in short supply. Trained technicians were scarce. Installation required extensive modifications to ships that were desperately needed at sea. By the end of 1942, perhaps 20 Japanese warships had operational radar. In the same time frame, the Americans had equipped virtually every cruiser and battleship in the Pacific Fleet with search radar and fire control systems. Most destroyers had at least search radar. Even PT boats were receiving small radar sets for night surface search. The quantitative difference was becoming a qualitative difference. American ships could detect Japanese forces before the Japanese could detect them. American ships could fire first, often achieving critical hits before Japanese gunners even knew they were under attack. Most devastating of all, American ships could coordinate their actions using radar data in ways that Japanese ships, relying on visual signals, could not. The Battle of Cape Esperance on October 11th and 12th provided the first clear demonstration of radar's decisive advantage in night combat. Rear Admiral Norman Scott's cruiser force, using the new SG radar on USS Helena and USS Boise, detected Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto's approaching bombardment force, while the Japanese had no idea American ships were present. The Japanese ships appeared on Helena's SG scope at 27,700 yards, more than 15 miles. Scott's force had nearly 15 minutes to prepare for action before visual contact. When American guns opened fire, Goto was utterly surprised. He initially believed his own ships were firing on him by mistake. By the time he realized American ships were attacking, it was too late. He was mortally wounded moments later when shells struck Aoba's bridge. The Japanese lost heavy cruiser Furutaka and destroyer Fubuki. 2 more destroyers would be sunk by aircraft the next day while attempting to rescue survivors. For the first time in the war, American surface forces had decisively defeated a Japanese night attack. Radar had provided the crucial advantage. The implications rippled through the combined fleet. Cape Esperance had not been a catastrophic defeat, but it shattered a crucial myth. Japanese forces could no longer operate at night with the confidence that darkness would protect them. The Americans could see through darkness now, not with optics or searchlights, but with invisible radio waves that revealed ship positions from beyond visual range. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff finally began to grasp what Commander Yamamoto had been trying to tell them since May. In a conference room at Naval Ministry headquarters on October 20th, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, convened a meeting of technical officers to assess American radar capabilities. The meeting lasted 7 hours. Commander Yamamoto presented his findings on captured equipment. Other officers contributed intelligence gathered from interrogations of prisoners and from radio intercepts. A signals intelligence officer reported that American ships were radiating electromagnetic energy at specific frequencies consistent with radar operation. Direction-finding stations had plotted these emissions and determined that virtually every American cruiser and most destroyers were now radar-equipped. The conclusion was unavoidable and stark. The Americans possessed 3 to 5 years lead in radar development, deployment, and tactical integration. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. They were producing radar sets at a rate Japan could not match. They were training operators by the thousands, while Japan struggled to train dozens. Most critically, they were developing tactics and command structures to exploit radar that the Japanese had not even begun to consider. Vice Admiral Ugaki listened to the presentations in growing dismay. He understood tactics, strategy, logistics, but this electronic warfare was almost incomprehensible to an officer trained in the era of optical rangefinders and visual signals. How did one fight an enemy who could see through darkness? How did one close to torpedo range when the enemy knew your position before you knew his? The answer, as it would turn out, was that you could not. Not without radar of your own, and acquiring radar in the quantities needed would take years Japan did not have. November 13th, 1942. The waters off Guadalcanal, now called Iron Bottom Sound, for the dozens of ships littering its floor. Another night, battle is developing. Japanese ships attempting to bombard Henderson Field encounter an American cruiser-destroyer force under Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan. Both sides are approximately equal in strength, but only one side can see in the dark. The American ships have radar. USS San Francisco has the older SC model. USS Helena, USS Juneau, and USS Portland have the newer SG sets. The destroyer, USS O'Bannon, has a portable search radar. Together, these systems create an electronic picture of the battlefield that extends 10 to 15 miles in all directions. The Japanese have lookouts, excellent lookouts, trained to extraordinary visual acuity, but lookouts who cannot see beyond 4 or 5 miles on a dark tropical night. The battle that unfolds is chaotic and brutal. American radar provides detection, but the tactical execution remains flawed. Ships fire on their own forces. Communications collapse. Admiral Callahan is killed when a Japanese shell destroys San Francisco's bridge. But despite the chaos, despite the tactical confusion, the Americans achieve something critical. They know where every Japanese ship is. They can shoot first. They can coordinate fires, however imperfectly. The Japanese fight with desperate courage. Their torpedoes sink destroyers USS Barton, USS Laffey, USS Cushing, and USS Monson. Their shells batter cruisers, killing Rear Admiral Callahan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott, but they are fighting partially blind. Their visual detection gives them targets only after the Americans have already opened fire. Their beautiful tactics, perfected through decades of night training, become nearly impossible to execute when the enemy sees them first. When dawn breaks on November 14th, both sides have been mauled. The Japanese lose battleship Hiei, which is scuttled after American aircraft cripple her the next morning. 2 destroyers are also lost. The Americans lose more ships in terms of numbers, but the strategic result is clear. The Japanese bombardment mission has failed. Henderson Field remains operational. More critically, the invisible electronic advantage is growing every day. In December comes Tassafaronga, perhaps the most instructive battle of them all. 8 American cruisers and destroyers intercept 8 Japanese destroyers, attempting a supply run. The Americans have overwhelming firepower superiority. They have radar on every ship. They detect the Japanese destroyers at over 20,000 yards and open fire with devastating effect, immediately crippling destroyer Takananami. But Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, the Japanese commander, is one of the finest destroyer tacticians in any navy. Despite being surprised, despite operating in darkness against radar-equipped opponents, he executes a perfectly timed torpedo salvo. 22 Type 93 long-lance torpedoes streak through the night. 4 American cruisers are hit. USS Northampton sinks. USS Minneapolis, USS New Orleans, and USS Pensacola are all devastated, requiring months of repairs. Tactically, Tanaka has achieved one of the most brilliant victories in naval history. Strategically, it changes nothing. The supply mission fails. The transports are turned back. Henderson Field continues operations. And most tellingly, Tanaka understands that his victory, though spectacular, is not repeatable. He writes in his after-action report that Japanese forces can no longer operate in waters dominated by American radar without suffering prohibitive losses. For the Americans, Tassafaronga is a wake-up call. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, reviews the after-action reports with fury. His ships have radar. They detected the enemy first. They should have won decisively. Instead, they took terrible losses because tactical doctrine had not caught up with technological capability. Nimitz issues a directive that will echo through the Pacific War. Training, training, and more training. Radar schools are expanded. Fighter direction courses are created. Combat information centers are designed and installed on every major combatant. Officers are drilled relentlessly in radar-directed tactics. The technology exists. Now the doctrine must catch up. By mid-1943, the transformation is complete. American ships now fight night battles with radar-directed tactics that exploit their electronic advantage fully. Task forces maintain formation using radar navigation. Guns are laid on target using radar bearings before visual contact. Fighter directors, vector interceptors, with precision that would have been impossible a year earlier. The Japanese, meanwhile, struggle to field radar in meaningful quantities. By June 1943, perhaps 50, Japanese warships have operational radar. Most sets are copies of the captured SCR-268, poorly manufactured and unreliable. Operators are inadequately trained. Command structures have not adapted to exploit radar data. The gap is widening rather than closing. The Battle of Kula Gulf on July 6 and 7, 1943, demonstrates the new reality. American cruisers and destroyers, using radar and newly developed tactics, detect Japanese forces and maneuver to achieve optimal firing positions before the Japanese even know American ships are present. 2 Japanese destroyers are sunk, another is badly damaged. The Americans lose light cruiser USS Helena to torpedoes, but the overall engagement favors the side with better electronic eyes. 6 days later, at the Battle of Kolombangara, the pattern repeats. American radar detects Japanese forces first. American guns open fire first. Japanese torpedoes still inflict damage. The long lance remains deadly, but the fundamental advantage has shifted. Darkness no longer protects Japanese forces. It amplifies American advantage. But perhaps the most revealing moment comes not from a major battle, but from a small engagement in August. At Vela Gulf, 6 American destroyers under Commander Frederick Moosbrugger encounter 4 Japanese destroyers on a supply run. The American ships have radar. They have practiced radar-directed torpedo attacks extensively. They detect the Japanese at 12 miles and execute a perfectly coordinated strike. All 6 American destroyers launch torpedoes simultaneously, 24 weapons targeting 4 unsuspecting ships. 3 Japanese destroyers are sunk in minutes. The 4th escapes damaged. The Americans suffer no damage at all. It is the kind of perfect ambush that Japanese forces had inflicted on the Allies throughout 1942. But now, the tables have turned. The hunters have become the hunted. For Japanese commanders, the realization is crushing. Admiral Tanaka, writing after the war, reflects on this period with brutal honesty. We could still win individual battles through superior tactics and the long lance torpedo. But we were fighting with one eye closed while the Americans had both eyes open. Radar gave them situational awareness we could not match. No amount of training or courage could overcome the fundamental disadvantage of operating blind. The technical disparity went beyond simple detection. By late 1943, American ships were being equipped with combat information centers, specially designed spaces where radar data from multiple sources could be synthesized and presented to commanders. These CICs represented a fundamental revolution in naval command and control. A commander in a CIC could see the entire battlefield displayed on plotting boards and radar scopes. He could vector fighters, coordinate gunfire, maneuver multiple ships as an integrated formation, all while remaining below decks, protected from enemy fire. Japanese ships had nothing comparable. Commanders fought from open bridges, exposed to weather and enemy fire, relying on verbal reports from lookouts and radio operators. There was no central space where information could be integrated and analyzed. Decisions were made based on fragmentary data, often delayed or inaccurate. The cognitive load on Japanese commanders was overwhelming, while American commanders had electronic assistance to manage complexity. The disparity was perhaps most evident in fighter direction. American carriers by mid-1943 had dedicated fighter director officers who controlled combat air patrols using radar data. They could see incoming raids at 60 to 70 miles. They could vector fighters to optimal intercept positions. They could stack cap at multiple altitudes to counter different threats. The system was not perfect, but it was continuously improving. Japanese carriers still directed fighters using visual signals and radio calls. There was no radar picture of the battle space. Combat air patrol was positioned by doctrine and visual observation. When American strikes approached, Japanese fighters often could not find them until it was too late, or they found them but at the wrong altitude, leaving strike aircraft unprotected while fighters chased decoys. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 would demonstrate the cumulative effect of these disparities. American carriers, their task forces controlled by radar navigation, their fighters directed by sophisticated fighter direction systems, their ships protected by radar-controlled anti-aircraft fire, annihilated Japanese naval aviation in what pilots would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese aircraft approaching the American fleet were detected at extreme range. Fighters were positioned perfectly for interception. Formations were tracked from 70 miles out, allowing multiple interception attempts. Those few Japanese aircraft that penetrated to the fleet faced anti-aircraft fire directed by the SCR-584 radar, which could track aircraft and automatically lay guns with devastating precision. Of approximately 375 Japanese aircraft that attacked, 315 were shot down. American losses were fewer than 30 aircraft. It was not a battle. It was a technological execution. Japanese pilots, many of them inadequately trained replacements for veterans, lost at Midway and in the Solomons, flew into an electronic kill zone that gave them almost no chance of success. No amount of courage or determination could overcome the systemic advantage of radar-directed defense. In Tokyo, in the autumn of 1944, the Naval General Staff finally commissioned a comprehensive study of radar and the technological gap with America. The study took 3 months and filled 200 pages. Its conclusions were devastating and too late to matter. The Americans had begun serious radar development in the mid-1930s. They had produced their first operational systems in 1939. By Pearl Harbor, they had deployed hundreds of radar sets across the Pacific. By mid-1944, they were producing radar systems by the thousands. Every combatant ship had multiple radar types. Every aircraft had sophisticated radio navigation aids. Every major airfield had complete radar coverage for hundreds of miles. Japanese radar development, by contrast, had not begun in earnest until 1942, after the war had already started. Production remained limited by component shortages and inadequate manufacturing capacity. By the end of 1944, perhaps 200 Japanese warships had operational radar. The systems were less reliable than American equivalents. Operators were less well-trained. Tactical doctrine remained underdeveloped. But the numerical disparity masked an even more fundamental problem. The Americans had built an entire technological infrastructure around radar. Research laboratories at MIT and other universities developed new systems. Defense contractors competed to improve performance and reduce costs. Standardized components allowed rapid repair and replacement. Training schools produced thousands of replacements, qualified operators. Tactical development kept pace with technology, creating new ways to exploit new capabilities. Japan had none of this infrastructure. Research was fragmented between Army and Navy programs that refused to cooperate. Manufacturing was limited to a few companies working in isolation. Component production relied on imports from Germany that were increasingly disrupted by Allied naval dominance. Training was minimal. Tactical development was an afterthought. The study concluded with a recommendation that was simultaneously obvious and impossible. Japan needed to commit massive resources to radar development and production. It needed to build the industrial base to manufacture thousands of sets. It needed to train tens of thousands of operators. It needed to completely revise tactical doctrine across all services. All of this would take 3 to 5 years minimum. The Americans had started 15 years earlier and were still improving. The race was already lost. The recommendation was filed and forgotten. By 1945, the disparity had become almost comical in its magnitude. American radar could detect Japanese aircraft at 100 miles. American ships could navigate by radar in complete darkness or dense fog. American fighter directors could manage hundreds of aircraft simultaneously. American fire control radar could track targets and automatically direct gunfire with precision impossible through visual means. The most devastating example came during the Kamikaze campaign. Japanese aircraft, flying suicide missions against American ships, were detected by radar at extreme ranges. Fighter patrols were vectored to intercept them. Those that penetrated to the fleet faced radar-controlled anti-aircraft fire of unprecedented accuracy. The SCR-584 radar, used at Okinawa, could track individual aircraft and provide fire control data that resulted in hit percentages exceeding 80% for experienced gun crews. Even suicide aircraft, willing to exchange their lives for hits, could not overcome the electronic defensive networks. Most were shot down before reaching their targets. Those that did strike often hit less valuable ships because the most important vessels were buried deep in the formation, protected by layers of radar-directed defense. Commander Yukichi Yamamoto, who had examined the first captured American radar in May 1942, survived the war. In the chaos of Japan's surrender, much of the documentation at Naval Technical Research Institute was destroyed. But Yamamoto kept his personal notes and his reports. In 1947, now working as a civilian engineer, he was interviewed by American technical intelligence officers, compiling a history of Japanese radar development. His assessment was blunt and reflected 3 years of watching Japan fall further behind. We never understood that radar was not just a technology. It was a system that required industrial capacity we did not have, training infrastructure we did not build, and tactical thinking we did not develop. We tried to copy individual radars when we should have been copying the entire American approach to technological warfare. The Americans, he noted, had treated technology as a multiplier of human capability. They did not expect their operators to have superhuman skill. They designed systems that average people could use effectively. They built training programs that could produce competent operators in months rather than years. They created maintenance systems that kept equipment operational in combat conditions. Japan, by contrast, had treated technology as a tool for elite specialists. Radar operators required extensive training. Maintenance demanded highly skilled technicians. The systems were complex and temperamental. This approach might have worked if Japan had decades to build the necessary expertise. In a war lasting only 4 years, it was a recipe for disaster. Most fundamentally, Yamamoto argued, Japan had failed to understand that modern warfare was becoming an industrial and technological competition as much as a test of military valor. The side with better technology, produced in greater quantity, operated by adequately trained personnel, would win regardless of the courage or skill of individual warriors. Spiritual strength alone could not defeat radar. Determination could not overcome electronic detection. Tradition could not compete with innovation backed by industrial might. The captured radars from Corregidor had told this story in May 1942, but the message had not been heard until far too late. By the time Japanese admirals truly understood what they were facing, the war was already lost. Not in any single battle, but in the cumulative weight of technological disparity that ground down Japanese capability month by month until nothing remained but the bitter recognition of how completely they had been outmatched. Today, in the deep waters off Guadalcanal, off the Philippines, off Okinawa, lie the wrecks of dozens of Japanese ships. Many were sunk by aircraft they never saw approaching. Many were hit by gunfire directed by radar they could not detect. Many were caught by submarines that found them using electronic means they did not possess. The ships themselves were well designed, well built, well fought, Their crews were brave, skilled, dedicated. But they were fighting an enemy they could not see, with eyes that could not penetrate darkness, against technology they did not possess and could not quickly acquire. The outcome, from the moment American radar networks became operational, was mathematically inevitable. The lesson of Japanese radar development, or rather the lack of it, extends far beyond World War II. It speaks to the nature of technological competition between nations, to the importance of long-term investment in research and development, to the necessity of building industrial capacity before war begins, rather than after, to the recognition that modern warfare rewards systems, thinking over heroic individuals. Japan had built a navy around the concept of the decisive battle, where superior training and tactics would overcome material disadvantage. They had perfected night fighting, confident that darkness would favor the side with better trained lookouts and superior optics. They had created weapons of extraordinary capability, from the long-lance torpedo to the Zero fighter. But they had not built the electronic infrastructure to fight in the modern age. They had not recognized that the enemy who can see furthest wins before the battle even begins. They had not understood that in 20th century warfare, the side with better technology, produced in overwhelming quantity, determines the outcome regardless of traditional military virtues. In the end, the story of Japanese radar is not really about radar at all. It is about the collision between industrial modernity and traditional military culture, between quantity and quality, between systems and heroes, between patient technological development and the desperate attempt to catch up after war has already begun, between an enemy who spent a decade preparing for electronic warfare and a nation that did not begin serious radar development until after the shooting started. It is a story of how a sophisticated, technologically capable nation could nonetheless lose a technological race they did not fully recognize they were running, of how 6 months of victories could mask fundamental weaknesses that would require years to address, of how the gap between the technologically advanced and the technologically behind grows exponentially once established. The captured radars from Corregidor, sitting in laboratories at Yokosuka in May 1942, had told the entire story. American industrial capacity, American technological depth, American systems thinking. The ability to produce complex equipment by the thousands, the infrastructure to deploy, maintain, and operate it at scale, the tactical innovation to exploit it effectively. 3 years later, American radar networks would guide the bombers that burned Japan's cities, would direct the fighters that swept Japanese aircraft from the skies, would control the naval guns that bombarded Japanese shores, would see through darkness and clouds and distance to find targets that had nowhere left to hide. The Americans had not just won the technological race, they had been running a different race entirely, one that began years before war started and continued with relentless industrial momentum until victory was complete. By the time Japanese admirals understood what they were facing, the race was long over. The Americans were not just ahead, they were so far ahead that catching up was impossible. That was the truth Commander Yamamoto had tried to communicate in May 1942. That was the truth Japanese admirals had learned, battle by battle, throughout the grinding campaigns of 1943 and 1944. That was the truth that made itself undeniable in the waters off the Philippines and Okinawa in 1945. The Americans could see 100 miles through darkness, the Japanese could not. In modern warfare, that difference alone was enough to determine who would win and who would lose. Everything else, all the courage and skill and tradition and determination, mattered far less than that single, brutal, technological fact. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.